the woman stepping down from the stagecoach in Ardmore, Oklahoma Territory, wore shame like a veil, her eyes downcast and her gloved hands trembling as they gripped a worn carpet bag that held everything she owned in the world. The year was 1889, and the red dust of the territory seemed to color everything with the same rust-tinged hue, from the weathered buildings lining the main street to the horizon that stretched endlessly in all directions. She was Delilah Zimmerman, 23 years old, and she had traveled nearly 1,000 miles to marry a man she had never met, a man whose letters promised safety and a fresh beginning far from the nightmares that had marked her skin and soul. The driver had told her that James Quincy's ranch was about 5 miles northeast of town, but he would be meeting her at the hotel first, as his letters had indicated. Delilah's heart hammered in her chest as she stood on the dusty street, watching the other passengers disperse into the afternoon heat. The sun beat down mercilessly, and she could feel sweat gathering at her temples beneath the high collar of her traveling dress, a modest gray garment that covered every inch of her from neck to wrists to ankles. She had chosen it specifically for that reason. The hotel was easy enough to find, a 2-story structure with a painted sign that read Ardmore Hotel in faded letters. Delilah climbed the 3 steps to the entrance, her legs stiff from days of travel, and pushed through the door into the relative coolness of the lobby. A clerk behind the desk looked up, his expression pleasant enough, and she approached with small, hesitant steps. "I am looking for James Quincy," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I believe he was expecting me today." The clerk nodded. "Yes, madam. He was here about an hour ago, but he had to head over to the land office for some business. Said he would be back before 5 o'clock. Would you like to freshen up? I can get you a room for the afternoon." Delilah wanted to weep with relief at the reprieve, at the chance to compose herself before meeting the man who would become her husband. She nodded gratefully and accepted the key the clerk offered, then made her way upstairs to a small but clean room that overlooked the street. Once inside, she set down her carpet bag and sank onto the edge of the bed, her shoulders finally relaxing for the first time in days. She removed her gloves slowly, staring down at her hands. The scars started at her wrists, pale and puckered lines that crisscrossed her forearms like a map of suffering. She had more scars elsewhere, hidden beneath layers of fabric, souvenirs from a husband who had believed his fists were the proper tools for keeping a wife in line. Martin Zeller had been his name, and he had died 2 years ago in a fight outside a saloon in Kansas, leaving Delilah widowed at 21 with nothing but debts and injuries to remember him by. The shame had followed her, even after his death. The townspeople had whispered that a woman must have done something to deserve such treatment, that she must have been defiant or neglectful of her duties. When she could no longer bear their judgment, she had answered an advertisement in a newspaper, a rancher in Oklahoma Territory looking for a wife. His name was James Quincy, and his letters had been kind, practical, and most importantly, distant enough from Kansas that no one would know her story unless she chose to tell it. She had not chosen to tell it. Her letters to James had mentioned she was a widow, but nothing more. She had hidden the truth, just as she now hid her scars beneath long sleeves and high collars, afraid that if he saw them he would turn her away or worse, assume she deserved them. Delilah washed her face in the basin provided, attempting to remove the dust of travel, then sat in the single chair by the window to wait. Minutes stretched into an hour and she watched the street below, the comings and goings of a territory town where life moved at a slower, more deliberate pace than the cities she had known. Cowboys rode through on horseback, their hats pulled low against the sun. Women in calico dresses moved between the general store and the butcher shop. Children chased each other down the boardwalks, their laughter carrying up to her room. At precisely 5 o'clock, a man on a sorrel horse tied up outside the hotel. Delilah's breath caught as she watched him dismount. He was tall, broad-shouldered, moving with the easy confidence of someone who spent his days working with his hands. He wore dusty denim pants, a blue shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. Even from her vantage point, she could see the strength in him, and for a moment, fear coiled in her stomach, an old instinct that remembered how strength could be used to hurt. She forced herself to stand, to smooth down her skirts, to take a breath and remind herself that James Quincy's letters had been gentle, that not all men were like Martin. She retrieved her gloves and pulled them on carefully, then made her way back downstairs, her heart in her throat. James Quincy stood in the lobby, his hat now in his hands, revealing dark hair that needed a trim and a face that was weathered by sun and wind. His eyes were gray, the color of storm clouds, and they found Delilah immediately as she descended the stairs. He was 30 years old, she knew from his letters, and there was something solid about him, something that spoke of reliability and hard work. "Miss Zimmerman?" he asked, his voice deep and steady. "Yes," she managed, stopping a few feet away from him, her hands clasped tightly together. "Mr. Quincy." "James is fine," he said, and his mouth curved into a small smile that seemed genuine. "I hope your travels were not too difficult. They were long, but I am grateful to have arrived safely." There was a pause, an awkward moment where neither seemed certain what to say next. Delilah kept her eyes lowered, afraid to meet his gaze directly, afraid he would see the fear and shame she carried. James shifted his weight, then cleared his throat. "I thought we might have supper at the restaurant down the street," he said. "Give you a chance to rest and eat before we head out to the ranch. It is about an hour's ride and the sun will be setting soon. We can stay in town tonight if you prefer, head out in the morning." "That is kind of you," Delilah said. "Whatever you think best." She saw his eyes narrow slightly, a flicker of something she could not quite read, but he nodded and gestured toward the door. "Supper first, then. We can decide after." The restaurant was small, with only 6 tables, but the food smelled wonderful, and Delilah realized she had not eaten anything substantial since the morning. James held out a chair for her, and she sat, careful to keep her gloves on even as she unfolded the napkin in her lap. The proprietor came over, a stout woman with a friendly face, and James ordered stew for them both along with fresh bread and coffee. "You mentioned in your letters that you worked as a seamstress," James said once they were alone again. "Is that something you would want to continue?" "There is not much call for it out at the ranch, but in town, I am sure you could find work if you wanted." Delilah looked up, surprised. "I had assumed my duties would be at the ranch." "Well, yes, but I am not looking for a servant," James said, his brow furrowing. "I am looking for a partner, a wife. If you have skills you enjoy using, I would not want to take that from you." It was such an unexpected statement that Delilah felt tears prick at her eyes. She blinked them away quickly, nodding. "That is generous of you. It is just fair," he said simply. The stew arrived, and they ate in relative silence, though it was not entirely uncomfortable. Delilah could feel James watching her occasionally, and she wondered what he saw, what he thought of the quiet woman who would not meet his eyes and kept her hands covered. She wished she could be braver, more open, but the lessons of her first marriage ran deep. After supper, James suggested they take a walk. The sun was lowering toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, and the heat of the day was beginning to ease. Delilah agreed, and they strolled down the main street at a leisurely pace. James pointed out various establishments, the general store run by Mr. Anderson, the blacksmith who could repair anything, the church where services were held each Sunday. "It is a good town," James said. "People look out for each other here. I came out 5 years ago with almost nothing, worked as a ranch hand for a while before I could save enough to buy my own land. It has been hard work, but it is starting to pay off." "What do you raise?" Delilah asked, finding her voice a little steadier now. "Cattle mostly, some horses. I have about 200 head right now, hoping to expand in the next few years. I built the house myself. It is not fancy, but it is solid. There are 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a main room. I have a good well, and the pastures are strong." He was describing his ranch with pride, but not arrogance, and Delilah could hear the satisfaction in his voice. This was a man who valued what he had built, who took nothing for granted. They reached the edge of town where the buildings gave way to open land, and James stopped, turning to face her. "I want you to know, Delilah, that I will not force you into anything. I know this is a strange situation, agreeing to marry someone you have never met. If you need time, we can take it. I have a spare bedroom you can use until you are comfortable." Delilah felt her throat tighten. His consideration was almost painful in its contrast to what she had known before. "You are very kind, James. I am just trying to be decent," he said. "I know what it is like to feel alone in the world, to need a new beginning. I want this to work, but only if you want it to." She finally met his eyes, those gray eyes that seemed honest and clear. "I want it to work as well. Then we will make it work together," he said. They were married the next morning at the church in Ardmore, with the minister and his wife as witnesses. Delilah wore the same gray traveling dress, still gloved and high-collared, and James wore a clean shirt and his best denim pants. The ceremony was brief, the words spoken with sincerity, and when James kissed her cheek gently afterward, Delilah felt the first stirring of hope that perhaps her life could truly be different now. They rode out to the ranch in a wagon James had brought to carry Delilah's meager belongings. The land stretched out around them, rolling grasslands dotted with cattle, and in the distance, Delilah could see the modest house James had described. It was a simple structure, wood framed with a tin roof, but there was a covered porch at the front and a barn to the side, and everything looked well maintained. "This is it," James said, helping her down from the wagon. "Home." Delilah looked around, taking in the quiet, the vast sky, the sense of space after so much time feeling trapped. "It is peaceful. It can be lonely too," James admitted. "That is part of why I wanted a wife, not just for the company but for the partnership. Running a ranch takes more than one person." He carried her carpetbag into the house, and Delilah followed, stepping into the main room. The interior was sparse but clean, with a stone fireplace, a table with 2 chairs, and a few shelves holding dishes and supplies. James showed her the kitchen, which was basic but functional, and then the 2 bedrooms. The larger one was clearly his, with a bed and a trunk and clothing hung on pegs along the wall. The smaller one held a narrow bed and a single chair. "You can use this one," James said. "Like I said, until you are ready." Delilah set her carpetbag down on the bed and looked around the small space. It was strange to think that this was now her home, that she was married to this man she barely knew. But there was something about James that put her more at ease than she had felt in years. He was patient, respectful, and he seemed to mean what he said about partnership. Over the next few weeks, they settled into a routine. James rose before dawn to tend the cattle and horses, and Delilah took on the household tasks, cooking meals, washing clothing, keeping the house in order. She was a capable cook, having learned by necessity during her first marriage, and James praised her meals with genuine appreciation that made her cheeks warm. In the evenings, they sat together on the porch, watching the sunset and talking. James told her about his family back in Tennessee, about how he had left to seek his fortune in the West after his father died. He spoke of his hopes for the ranch, his plans to build a bigger herd, maybe even start selling horses to the army forts that were scattered throughout the territory. Delilah listened, asking questions occasionally, but she shared little of her own past, keeping her secrets locked tightly inside. James never pushed her, never demanded more than she offered. But she could see the curiosity in his eyes sometimes, the wonder at why she remained so covered, so reserved. The heat of summer in Oklahoma Territory was oppressive, and Delilah knew her long sleeves and high collars must seem strange, but she could not bring herself to remove them. The scars were her shame, and she feared his reaction if he saw them. One afternoon in late July, nearly a month after their marriage, disaster struck. A storm rolled in from the west, black clouds gathering with terrifying speed. James and Delilah were in the barn, tending the horses, when the first drops began to fall. Within minutes, the sky opened up, unleashing torrents of rain accompanied by howling wind and crackling lightning. "We need to get the cattle into the lower pasture," James shouted over the roar of the storm. "They will scatter otherwise." Delilah nodded, following him out into the deluge. They were both soaked within seconds, the rain coming down so hard it stung like needles. James mounted his horse, gesturing for Delilah to return to the house, but she shook her head. She had learned to ride in the past weeks, and she could help. Together, they rode out into the storm, herding the cattle away from the open hillside and toward the more sheltered pasture near the creek. The animals were frightened, bellowing and trying to run in all directions, and it took every bit of skill and determination to keep them together. Lightning forked across the sky, illuminating the landscape in stark flashes, and thunder boomed so loudly it seemed to shake the very earth. Delilah's horse shied at a particularly close lightning strike, and she nearly lost her seat, but she clung on, urging the mare forward. James was ahead of her, his figure barely visible through the sheets of rain, and she pushed to catch up. They worked for what felt like hours, though it was likely only 30 minutes before the last of the cattle were safely in the lower pasture. By the time they returned to the house, both were exhausted and drenched to the bone. Delilah stumbled through the door, her teeth chattering, and James followed, immediately moving to start a fire in the fireplace despite the summer heat. They needed to get warm and dry, or they would both catch their deaths. "You need to get out of those wet clothes," James said, his voice rough with cold and exertion. "I will get blankets." Delilah nodded, but as she reached up to unbutton her dress, she realized with horror that the rain had plastered the fabric to her skin, and her gloves were soaked through. Her fingers fumbled with the buttons, clumsy from cold and fear. She could not remove the dress without revealing her arms, and she could not keep the wet clothing on without risking illness. James returned with blankets, then paused when he saw her standing frozen by the door, her hands shaking as she tried to work the buttons. "Do you need help?" "No," Delilah's voice broke, and to her shame, tears began to mix with the rainwater on her face. "I can manage." "Delilah, you are freezing," James said, stepping closer. "Let me help." "Please do not," she whispered, but he was already reaching for the buttons, his fingers working them open with efficiency born of necessity. Delilah closed her eyes, unable to watch, unable to bear the moment when he would see what she had hidden for so long. The dress opened, and James eased it off her shoulders, down her arms. She heard his sharp intake of breath, felt him go still, and she wanted to disappear, to vanish into the floor and never face his judgment. "Delilah," he said softly. "What happened?" Her eyes opened, and she saw him looking at her forearms, at the network of scars that marred her skin. Some were thin, like the marks left by a belt or a switch. Others were thicker, the remnants of burns or deeper cuts. They were old scars, white against her skin, but they told a story of suffering that could not be denied. "I was married before," she said, her voice barely audible. "My husband, he had a temper." James was silent for a long moment, and Delilah forced herself to continue, the words spilling out in a rush now that the secret was exposed. "I tried to be a good wife. I tried to do everything right, but nothing was ever enough." "He would drink and then he would," she broke off, unable to finish. "He is the one who gave you these," James said, and it was not a question. "Yes. I know I should have left, I know I should have been stronger, but I had nowhere to go, and he always said it was my fault that I made him do it." The tears were coming faster now, years of shame and guilt pouring out. "He died 2 years ago, and I thought I would feel free, but I just felt broken. The town, they whispered about me, like I was something shameful. I wanted to start over where no one knew, but I was afraid if you saw, you would send me away." James set the blanket down and gently took her hands, removing the sodden gloves. He looked at the scars on her wrists, then at her arms, then finally at her face. "I would never send you away." "But I am marked, ruined. You are a survivor," James interrupted, his voice fierce. "These scars do not make you broken. They make you strong. Do you hear me? You lived through something terrible and you had the courage to leave to seek a new life. That is not shame, Delilah, that is bravery." She shook her head, but he cupped her face in his hands, forcing her to meet his eyes. "They make you beautiful to me." The words hit her like a physical force, and she gasped. "How can you say that?" "Because it is true. Every mark on your skin is proof that you survived, that you are still here, still standing. I do not see shame when I look at you. I see courage. I see resilience. I see a woman who deserved better than she got, and I want to spend the rest of my life making sure you never doubt your worth again." Delilah could not speak, could not breathe. No one had ever spoken to her this way, with such conviction, such respect. James wrapped the blanket around her shoulders, then eased her over to the chair by the now crackling fire. He went to change his own wet clothes, and when he returned, he brought her a dry nightgown and left the room so she could change in privacy. When she emerged, wrapped in the warm fabric, James had made coffee, and he pressed a cup into her hands. They sat together by the fire, the storm still raging outside, but inside, something had shifted between them. The barrier of secrets was gone, and in its place was a tentative intimacy, a beginning of true partnership. "Why did you want a mail-order bride?" Delilah asked after a while, her voice steadier now. James considered the question. "I was lonely, but more than that, I wanted someone to share this life with. Building something from nothing is hard work, and it is not much fun when there is no one to appreciate it with you. I wanted a wife, a companion, someone to come home to. I did not have romantic notions about love at first sight. I figured respect and affection could grow over time if we both worked at it." "And now?" she asked, daring to look at him. "Now I think I was right," he said simply. "I respect you, Delilah. I liked you from the start, but now, knowing what you have been through, knowing how strong you are, I admire you too. As for affection, well, I am hoping that will keep growing." She felt her face warm, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, it was not from shame but from something else, something that felt almost like hope. "I think I admire you too, James. You have been so patient with me." "Patience is easy when it is worth it," he said. The storm passed, and over the following weeks, something blossomed between them. Delilah stopped wearing gloves in the house, though she still kept her sleeves long out of habit. James complimented her often, not just on her cooking or her help with the ranch, but on her thoughts, her opinions, the way she saw the world. He asked her about her dreams, and when she admitted she had once hoped to open a dress shop, he suggested they could save toward that goal, make it happen in a few years. They took meals together on the porch in the evenings, talking until the stars came out. James told her about his childhood, about the brother he had lost to fever and the mother who had died when he was young. Delilah shared more of her past, not just the darkness but the moments of light too, the grandmother who had taught her to sew, the friends she had lost touch with after her marriage. One evening in August, as they sat watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple, James reached over and took Delilah's hand. She did not pull away, and he ran his thumb gently over the scars on her wrist. "Do they still hurt?" he asked. "Not physically," she said. "But sometimes I forget they are there, and then I catch sight of them and I remember." "Maybe, over time, they will just be part of you," James said. "Not a reminder of pain, but a reminder that you survived, that you are here." "I like that idea," Delilah said softly. He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her wrist, just above the scars, and Delilah felt her heart stutter. The tenderness of the gesture, the acceptance it represented, was almost overwhelming. "I want to kiss you properly," James said, his gray eyes meeting hers. "But only if you want me to." Delilah's breath caught. She had been waiting for this, afraid of it and wanting it in equal measure. She nodded and James leaned in, his lips meeting hers in a kiss that was gentle, reverent, and full of promise. When they pulled apart, Delilah was trembling, but not from fear. From something entirely different, something that felt like the beginning of healing. That night, for the first time since their marriage, Delilah did not sleep in the smaller bedroom. She went to James, knocking softly on his door, and when he opened it, she looked up at him with eyes that were finally free of shame. "I want to be your wife," she said. "Truly." James smiled, and it transformed his weathered face into something warm and welcoming. "I want that too. More than anything." He took her hand and drew her into the room, and they came together with a tenderness that Delilah had never known was possible. James was patient, careful, always asking if she was comfortable, if she wanted to continue. He kissed the scars on her arms, her shoulders, everywhere the marks existed, as though he could erase the pain with his affection. And for the first time in her life, Delilah understood that intimacy was not supposed to hurt, that it could be an expression of care and respect and growing love. Afterward, they lay together in the darkness, Delilah's head resting on James's chest as he ran his fingers through her hair. "I think I am falling in love with you," he whispered into the quiet. Delilah felt tears prick at her eyes, but they were good tears this time. "I think I am falling in love with you too." The ranch work continued, the rhythm of their days filled with labor and laughter. Delilah proved to be a quick learner, taking on more tasks as the weeks passed. She learned to rope calves, mend fences, even help with the branding when the time came. James praised her skills, his pride in her evident, and Delilah found herself standing taller, speaking more openly, shedding the weight of her past bit by bit. In September, they traveled into Ardmore for supplies, and Delilah walked through town with her head high, her gloves tucked into her reticule rather than on her hands. She did not hide anymore. Several women approached her, welcoming her to the community, and one, the minister's wife, invited her to a quilting circle that met each month. "I would like that," Delilah said, and she meant it. She was building a life here, a life that included friendships and community, not just the isolation she had known before. The general store was busy, and as they waited for Mr. Anderson to finish with another customer, James slipped his arm around Delilah's waist, drawing her close. She leaned into him, no longer afraid of his touch, no longer expecting pain where there was only affection. "Happy?" James asked, his lips close to her ear. "Yes," Delilah said, and she realized it was true. She was happy, genuinely and deeply, in a way she had thought was impossible for her. That winter brought challenges. Snow fell in the territory, not as heavy as in northern states, but enough to make the work harder. They lost a few calves to the cold, and one of the horses came up lame, requiring James to travel to the next town over to find a proper farrier. Delilah stayed at the ranch, managing everything in his absence, and when he returned 2 days later, he found her in the barn, tending to a cow that had gone into labor. "You did this alone?" he asked, impressed. "I had to," Delilah said, brushing hair from her sweaty forehead. "The calf was breech, but I managed to turn it. Mother and baby are both fine." James pulled her into a hug, not caring that she was covered in sweat and worse. "You are incredible." "I am a rancher's wife," she said with a smile. "It is part of the job." As the months turned into a year, Delilah found that the scars she carried, both visible and invisible, were beginning to fade into the background of her new life. They were still there, of course, but they no longer defined her. She was James's wife, a capable rancher, a valued member of the Ardmore community, a woman with dreams and plans for the future. The past was part of her story, but it was not the whole story. In the spring, Delilah realized her courses had not come, and she suspected she might be with child. She waited a few more weeks to be certain, then told James one evening as they sat on the porch, their usual spot for important conversations. "I think I am pregnant," she said, her heart in her throat. James's eyes widened and then a grin spread across his face, so wide and joyful it made Delilah laugh. "Truly, truly. I am almost certain." He whooped and pulled her into his arms, spinning her around until she was dizzy and laughing. "We are going to have a baby. Are you happy?" Delilah asked, even though his reaction made the answer obvious. "Happy does not even begin to cover it," James said. "I am Delilah. You have given me so much. A partner, a companion, and now a child. I could not ask for more." "You have given me so much too," Delilah said, her voice thick with emotion. "You gave me back myself, James. You made me believe I was worth something again." "You were always worth everything," he said fiercely. "Always." The pregnancy progressed smoothly, and Delilah worked alongside James for as long as she was able. The minister's wife and several other women from town came by regularly, bringing food, advice, and companionship. Delilah realized she had not just married James, she had been welcomed into a community that cared for its own. In late November, Delilah went into labor. James fetched the midwife from town, a capable woman named Clara who took charge of the situation with brisk efficiency. James paced in the main room, unable to stay away but not allowed into the bedroom, and finally, after hours of labor, a baby's cry pierced the air. Clara emerged, carrying a bundle, and James rushed over. "Mother and baby are both fine," Clara said, her face creased in a smile. "You have a son." James took the baby with trembling hands, looking down at the tiny face, the dark hair, the gray eyes that seemed to study him solemnly. "A son," he whispered. Clara gestured him toward the bedroom, and James went in to find Delilah propped up against pillows, exhausted but smiling. "I want to name him Daniel," she said. "After my grandfather." "Daniel Quincy," James said, testing the name. "I like it." He sat carefully on the edge of the bed, placing the baby in Delilah's arms, and they sat together, the three of them, a family forged from pain and patience and love. Daniel proved to be a healthy, vigorous baby, and James was a devoted father, waking in the night to bring the baby to Delilah for feedings, changing diapers without complaint, rocking his son when he fussed. Watching him, Delilah felt her love for her husband deepen even further. He was everything she had never believed a man could be. Gentle, supportive, present. As Daniel grew from infant to toddler, the ranch continued to thrive. James expanded the herd as planned, and Delilah, with James's encouragement, began taking orders for sewing from women in town. She did not have her own shop yet, but it was a beginning, a step toward the dream she had once abandoned. One afternoon, when Daniel was napping and Delilah was working on a dress for a customer, a stranger rode up to the ranch. James was out in the pasture, so Delilah went to the door, wiping her hands on her apron. The man was young, perhaps 19, and he looked nervous. "Can I help you?" Delilah asked. "I am looking for work," the young man said, removing his hat respectfully. "I heard Mr. Quincy might be hiring." Delilah considered. James had mentioned they could use help, especially during branding season. "He is out with the cattle, but he should be back soon." "Would you like to wait?" The young man agreed, and Delilah invited him to sit on the porch, bringing him water. They talked while they waited, and she learned his name was Thomas, that he had come from Missouri with his family. But his father had died and his mother and siblings had gone to live with relatives. He wanted to stay in the territory, make his own way. When James returned, Delilah explained the situation, and James interviewed Thomas, asking him about his experience with cattle and horses. Satisfied with the answers, James offered him a job and a place to stay in the small bunkhouse they had built the previous year, originally intended for storage but easily converted. Thomas proved to be a hard worker, and with his help, the ranch ran even more smoothly. Delilah found herself with more time to focus on her sewing, and she began to build a modest business, saving her earnings toward opening a shop in town. 2 years after Daniel's birth, Delilah gave birth to a daughter they named Grace. She had Delilah's dark hair and James's gray eyes, and she was as sweet-tempered as Daniel was energetic. The house felt full, noisy, and joyfully chaotic, a far cry from the silent, tense home Delilah had known in her first marriage. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching Daniel chase fireflies while Grace slept in Delilah's arms, James reached over and took her hand. "Do you remember the day you arrived in Ardmore?" "Of course," Delilah said. "I was so afraid." "I was nervous too," James admitted. "I kept wondering if I was doing the right thing, bringing someone all this way, hoping we could build a life together. But I do not wonder anymore. You are the best decision I ever made, Delilah." "You saved me, James. You made me believe I could be more than my scars." "You were always more than your scars," James said. "I just helped you see it." Delilah leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling the quiet contentment that came from being exactly where she belonged. The scars were still there, faint lines on her skin that would never fully disappear, but they no longer carried the weight of shame. They were simply part of her history, markers of where she had been and how far she had come. In the spring of 1895, 6 years after Delilah had first stepped off that stagecoach in Ardmore, she and James finally opened the dress shop she had dreamed of. It was a small establishment on the main street, but it was hers, the result of years of saving and planning. James had helped build the shelves and the counter, and on opening day he stood beside her, holding Daniel and Grace as customers filed in. The shop was a success, and Delilah found she loved the work, the creativity of designing and sewing, the satisfaction of seeing women pleased with their purchases. She did not run the shop every day. She still spent most of her time at the ranch, but having this space, this dream realized, meant more to her than she could express. One afternoon, as she was closing up the shop, a woman entered. She looked vaguely familiar, though Delilah could not place her immediately. The woman approached the counter, her expression uncertain. "I do not know if you remember me," the woman said. "I am Ruth. We lived in the same town in Kansas after your first husband died. Delilah's breath caught. She did remember Ruth, one of the women who had whispered, who had judged. Yes, I remember. Ruth looked down at her hands. I came to apologize. I heard you were here, running this shop, married to James Quincy, and I wanted to tell you I was wrong. We were all wrong back then. We should have helped you, not judged you. I am sorry. The apology was unexpected, and for a moment Delilah did not know what to say. Then she nodded slowly. Thank you for saying that. It was a difficult time. You look happy now, Ruth said, glancing around the shop. You have done well for yourself. I have been fortunate, Delilah said. I found a good man and a good life here. Ruth nodded, tears in her eyes. I am glad. You deserved that. After Ruth left, Delilah stood alone in the shop, thinking about how far she had come. From a woman who believed she was ruined and shameful to someone who owned her own business, who had a husband she loved and children she adored, who was respected in her community. The transformation felt almost miraculous. That evening, she told James about Ruth's visit. He listened, then pulled her close. I am glad she apologized, but you did not need her approval. You never did. I know, Delilah said, but it was still good to hear. As the years continued, the Quincy ranch grew in reputation and size. Thomas eventually left to start his own homestead, and James hired a couple to help with the work, a man named Peter and his wife Anna, who became close friends with Delilah. The children grew, Daniel becoming a capable young rancher himself by the time he was 10, and Grace showing a talent for sewing that made Delilah's heart swell with pride. In 1900, Delilah and James celebrated their 11th anniversary. They had planned a quiet dinner at home, but the community had other ideas, organizing a party at the church hall that brought together friends and neighbors. Delilah stood in the center of the hall, overwhelmed by the outpouring of affection, and James came to stand beside her, his arm around her waist. Did you ever imagine this? He asked. When you first arrived? Never, Delilah said honestly. I could not have imagined any of this. The happiness, the love, the life we built, it felt impossible. Nothing is impossible when you refuse to give up, James said. You taught me that, Delilah. Your courage, your resilience, it has inspired me every day. She turned in his arms, looking up at him, this man who had seen her scars and called them beautiful, who had loved her when she could not love herself. I want to tell the children, she said suddenly, about my scars, about my first marriage. I want them to know where I came from, so they understand that no one should be treated that way, that love should never hurt. James nodded seriously. I think that is a good idea, when you are ready. A few weeks later, Delilah sat Daniel and Grace down in the main room. They were 13 and 11 now, old enough to understand. She rolled up her sleeves, showing them the scars, and she told them the truth. She did not spare the difficult details, but she also emphasized the lessons. That she had survived, that she had found the courage to leave and seek a better life, that their father had shown her what true love was supposed to be. Daniel looked stricken, his young face angry. I wish I could have protected you. You could not have, Delilah said gently. But you can protect others by never treating anyone that way yourself, by speaking up when you see injustice. That is how you honor what I went through. Grace reached out and traced one of the scars on Delilah's arm. Papa says scars are proof we are strong. He is right, Delilah said, her throat tight. These scars are part of my story, but they are not the whole story. You too are part of my story. Papa is part of my story. The ranch, the shop, the friends we have, it is all part of who I am now. That night, as Delilah prepared for bed, James came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. I heard what you told the children. That was brave. I want them to know the truth, Delilah said. I do not want them to think life is easy or that people are always kind. But I also want them to know that good things can come from pain, that healing is possible. You are an incredible mother, James said, kissing her temple, and an incredible woman. I am who I am because of you, Delilah said. You made me believe in myself again. You did the hard work, James said. I just loved you while you did it. They stood together in the quiet of their bedroom, two people who had built something beautiful from very little, who had taken pain and turned it into purpose. The scars on Delilah's skin were still there, faint but present, and she no longer hid them. They were part of her, a map of her journey, and in the gray eyes of the man holding her, she saw nothing but acceptance, respect, and love. Another decade passed, and the Quincy Ranch became one of the most successful in the territory. Daniel took over much of the daily operations, showing a natural talent for ranching, while Grace helped Delilah expand the dress shop into a general haberdashery that sold fabric, notions, and ready-made clothing. James, now in his 50s, still worked the land, though he had eased back a bit. Content to let his son take the lead, Delilah, in her 40s, had gray threading through her dark hair, and lines had formed at the corners of her eyes from years of smiling. She was still beautiful, James told her often, more so now than when they had first met because she carried herself with confidence and grace. She no longer saw herself through the lens of her scars. She saw herself as a successful business owner, a loving mother, a devoted wife. One evening, as they sat on the porch as they had done for over 2 decades, watching the sunset paint the Oklahoma sky in brilliant colors, James took her hand. "Do you ever regret it? Answering my advertisement," Delilah laughed. "Not for a single moment do you regret placing it." "Never," James said. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Delilah. You made my house a home, my life complete." She leaned over and kissed him, tasting the familiar warmth of him, the steady, dependable love that had carried her through every challenge. "I love you, James Quincy. More than words can say." "I love you too, Delilah Quincy. Always have, always will." They sat in companionable silence, hands entwined, watching the day give way to night. Around them, the ranch was peaceful, the cattle settled, the horses grazing, the house behind them filled with the evidence of a life well lived. Photographs on the walls, handmade quilts on the beds, the sound of Grace singing in the kitchen as she prepared supper. Delilah thought back to the frightened woman who had stepped off that stage coach so many years ago, carrying nothing but scars and shame. That woman felt like a stranger now, someone from a different lifetime. The scars were still there, would always be there, but they no longer hurt. They were simply part of her, proof that she had survived, that she had overcome, that she had built something beautiful from the ashes of her pain. James had been right, all those years ago during that storm. The scars did not make her broken. They made her strong. And more than that, they made her who she was, the woman James loved, the mother her children admired, the business owner the community respected. As darkness fell and the stars began to emerge, Delilah rested her head on James's shoulder, feeling the quiet joy of a life lived fully, of love given and received, of pain transformed into purpose. She had come to Oklahoma territory with nothing but scars, and James had whispered they made her beautiful. She had not believed him then, but she believed him now. In the years that followed, Daniel married a local girl named Clara, and they gave Delilah and James 3 grandchildren. Grace met a school teacher who moved to Ardmore, and after a courtship that made Delilah smile with its tenderness and respect, they married as well, settling just outside town. The dress shop thrived, and Delilah eventually turned its management over to Grace while she focused on the ranch and her grandchildren. James remained healthy and active well into his 60s, still rising before dawn to watch the sun come up over the land he had built his life on. Delilah stayed by his side, as devoted to him in their later years as she had been in their early ones, perhaps even more so as time deepened their connection. One spring afternoon, when Delilah was in her 50s and James was nearing 65, they traveled into Ardmore for a community celebration marking the transition from territory to state. Oklahoma would officially become a state that year, 1907, and the town was alive with excitement and patriotic fervor. Delilah and James walked through the festivities, greeting friends, admiring the decorations, watching the children play. At one point, a photographer was taking pictures of families, and James insisted they have one done. Delilah protested, saying she was too old, but James would not hear it. They posed together, James's arm around her waist, Delilah's head leaning slightly toward him, and when the picture was developed weeks later, Delilah studied it with wonder. She saw a couple who had aged together, who bore the marks of time and labor, but who looked content, happy, complete. James's hair was white, his face deeply lined, but his eyes were bright. Delilah's own face showed her years, but there was peace in her expression, a serenity that the frightened young woman from Kansas had never known. "We look old," she said to James with a laugh. "We look happy," he corrected. "That is better than young." They framed the picture and hung it in the main room, next to pictures of the children and grandchildren, a testament to the family they had built, the life they had created. As the months and years continued, James began to slow down, and Delilah watched with concern as he moved more carefully, took more rests. He insisted he was fine, just aging naturally, but she worried. She could not imagine her life without him, this man who had saved her in every way that mattered. One night, as they lay in bed together, James turned to her. "If anything happens to me, I want you to know you have been the joy of my life, Delilah. Every single day with you has been a gift." "Do not talk that way," Delilah said, her voice thick. "You are going to be around for a long time yet." "I hope so," James said, "but I needed to say it, just in case." Delilah curled into him, holding him tightly. "You saved me, James. I do not know what I would have done without you." "You would have survived," James said, "because that is what you do. You survive and you thrive. But I am glad I got to be part of your story." "You are not just part of my story," Delilah whispered. "You are the whole story. Everything good in my life came from loving you." They fell asleep entwined as they had done for decades, two hearts beating in quiet harmony. James lived another 8 years, well into his 70s, remaining active and engaged with the ranch and family until the very end. When he finally passed away peacefully in his sleep, Delilah was beside him, holding his hand. The grief was profound, a tearing loss that left her feeling adrift, but even in her sorrow she knew that she would be all right. James had spent their marriage teaching her to be strong, to value herself, to believe in her worth, and those lessons had taken root deep in her soul. At his funeral, held at the church in Ardmore, the building was packed with people whose lives James had touched. Neighbors, business partners, friends, all came to pay their respects. Daniel spoke about his father with pride and love, and Grace read a poem that had Delilah in tears. When it was Delilah's turn to speak, she stood before the assembled crowd, her voice steady. "James Quincy was the best man I ever knew," she said. "He took a frightened, broken woman and showed her that she was strong, that her scars did not define her, that she was capable of building a beautiful life. He loved me not despite my flaws but with them, seeing beauty where I saw shame. I will miss him every day for the rest of my life, but I will also be grateful, because he gave me more than I ever thought possible. He gave me myself. After the service, as people filed by to offer condolences, Delilah stood with Daniel and Grace on either side of her, their children and grandchildren around them, and she felt James's presence in the love that surrounded her. He had built more than a ranch. He had built a legacy of kindness, respect, and enduring love. In the months that followed, Delilah stayed on at the ranch, though Daniel managed the operations. She spent her days tending her garden, visiting with her grandchildren, and occasionally helping out at the haberdashery. She missed James with an ache that never fully went away, but she also felt his presence in everything around her, in the house he had built, the land he had worked, the family they had created together. One evening, as she sat alone on the porch watching the sunset, Daniel came and sat beside her. "How are you doing, Mama?" "I am all right," Delilah said honestly. "It is hard, but I am managing. Your father would not want me to give up on life. He loved you so much," Daniel said. "I hope I can love Clara the way he loved you." "You already do," Delilah said with a smile. "I see it every day. You learned from the best." Daniel reached over and took her hand, studying the scars that were still faintly visible. "I remember when you showed me these and told me your story. It made me so angry, but it also made me determined never to be that kind of man." "That is the best legacy your father and I could leave," Delilah said. "Teaching you to be kind, to be respectful, to value the people in your life." Grace arrived then, bringing supper, and the three of them sat together on the porch, talking and laughing, remembering James in stories and shared memories. It was bittersweet, but it was also healing, and Delilah realized that even in grief, she was surrounded by love. Delilah lived another decade, well into her 70s, remaining active and engaged with her family. She saw her grandchildren grow, marry, have children of their own, and she delighted in each new generation, telling them stories about their grandfather, about the ranch, about the life she and James had built from nothing. She never remarried. Some well-meaning friends suggested it, but Delilah had no interest. She had known the great love of her life, and nothing could replace that. She was content to live out her days surrounded by family, secure in the knowledge that she had survived, thrived, and built something beautiful. One spring afternoon, feeling more tired than usual, Delilah lay down for a nap and simply did not wake up. She passed peacefully at the age of 76, and when Daniel found her, there was a slight smile on her face, as though she was dreaming of something wonderful. At her funeral, also held at the church in Ardmore, the building was once again filled to capacity. Daniel spoke about his mother's strength, her resilience, her capacity for love. Grace spoke about the lessons she had learned from Delilah, about the importance of courage and self-worth. The grandchildren shared memories of a grandmother who was kind, wise, and endlessly supportive. They buried Delilah beside James in the cemetery on a hill overlooking the ranch. And as the minister spoke the final words, a warm breeze moved through the trees, carrying the scent of wildflowers. Daniel looked at Grace, and they both smiled, feeling that their parents were together again, as they were always meant to be. The ranch continued under Daniel's management, and the haberdashery thrived under Grace and her children. The Quincy name remained respected in Ardmore and the surrounding areas, a testament to the life James and Delilah had built, the values they had instilled, the love they had shared. Years later, when Daniel was an old man himself, he sat his own grandchildren down and told them the story of their great-grandmother Delilah, about the scars she carried, the courage she had shown, and the beautiful life she had built. He showed them the picture of James and Delilah from the statehood celebration, two people aged but content, happy, complete. "Your great-grandfather used to say that scars make you beautiful," Daniel said. He was talking about more than just physical scars. He meant that everything we go through, all the pain and struggle and difficulty, it shapes us into who we are. And if we refuse to give up, if we keep trying, keep loving, keep building, then those scars become proof of our strength, not our weakness. The children listened, absorbing the lesson, and Daniel felt satisfied that the legacy was being passed down, that the story of James and Delilah would continue to inspire future generations. In Ardmore, the haberdashery eventually became a historical site, preserved as one of the oldest continuously operating businesses in the state. A small plaque was placed outside, mentioning Delilah Quincy, who had opened the shop in 1895 and built it into a thriving enterprise. Tourists would stop and read the plaque, impressed by the entrepreneurial spirit of this woman from over a century ago, never knowing the full story of where she came from, what she overcame, and the love that had made it all possible. But on the ranch that Daniel's descendants still operated, the story was known, told around dinner tables and on porch swings, a reminder that no matter how dark the past, the future could be bright. That scars did not have to define you, that love could heal even the deepest wounds, and that two people who refused to give up on each other could build something that lasted generations. The land remained the same, the red Oklahoma soil, the rolling grasslands, the vast sky that seemed to go on forever. But the people who worked that land, who lived in the house James built, who tended the cattle and horses, they all carried within them the legacy of a mail-order bride who came with nothing but scars and a cowboy who whispered they made her beautiful. And together, they created a love story that would never be forgotten.